As far as I know, I'm the only full-time prosecutor in the entire country that just handles animal abuse and animal neglect cases. I work for the city of Los Angeles. I started doing this exclusively about 8 years ago. I see cases ranging from the most horrible abuse, torturing of animals, dog fighting, cockfighting, and maybe the worst is animal neglect, where people just let their animals die, very slow deaths. And on top of that, I propose legislation, work on policies for the city and the state of California, and I consult with other cities and the rest of the country. The most recent legislation that I've worked on is actually a forfeiture bill in California that's currently in Sacramento, and that will allow the government to seize the property of people who fight dogs. Some of the most disturbing cases involve domestic violence. There is such a link between animal abuse and violence against people, and we see it so often where men are abusing women and children in the family, and almost every time if there's a pet, we see that the pet has also been abused. And if we see that pets are being abused, if we look deeper into the family situation, more often than not we find out that children and the women are abused too. The link is so obviously there. When I first started doing the job, I was very excited and very passionate and emotional. I found that the emotion was getting in the way of being a good lawyer. I've had to really develop a professional approach towards these cases and distance myself in some ways from the emotionalism. Looking at the photos of these animals in my cases, I can tell you that I have friends who are police detectives that do homicide cases and won't look at the photos of my cases. Judges who make the photos force us to seal them in envelopes. So it is hard to deal with. I think the way I handle it is knowing that these animals don't die in vain. In fact, the few times that I've actually cried in the car on the way home is not because of what happened to an animal, but because the court system didn't do what it should have done. There was no justice. And I think also rescuing animals at home, the ones that need help, that helps me balance some of the tragedy that I see every day at work. A lot of people say, well, how do you go into a shelter? How do you rescue animals? Doesn't it make you sad? If I was just watching, it would be sad, but knowing that I'm doing something, it's not enough, but I'm doing something, I think that's what makes it livable for me. I think it's very noble that there's prosecutors around the country, special prosecutors that are taking a special interest in animal cases. But until animal cruelty is treated like any other crime, as a serious crime, and not something that is special, until that happens, I don't think we're going to be making really inroads into animal cruelty in this country. Every prosecutor in every county and city in this country needs to know the laws on animal abuse and know that it's okay and encouraged to prosecute these cases. When that happens, the judges will be educated and the juries will be educated. So I place the responsibility on the prosecutors who learn the law, and then they encourage the police to investigate it, and the judges will do the appropriate action. I think the second most important thing is that law enforcement around the country has to also accept responsibility for handling animal cruelty. This is not a job for animal control officers, for the people that do licensing and dog catching. This is a crime that needs to be handled by the same cops that are trained to handle murder, rape, and robbery. The FBI actually lists animal cruelty as one of the best indicators of future criminal activity. When I was growing up, I remember pyromania was an indicator that if a small child was playing with fire, that was a red flag, that this child could be in for trouble later on. Now it is well documented that maybe the best predictor of future violence is children who are abusive to animals. And I'm not talking about young children who are experimenting, learning how to touch an animal and may touch it a little bit roughly. We're talking about children who get pleasure and joy out of torturing animals. I see it all the time. I know teachers that see it. And yet, right now in this country, there's really no structure for knowing how to respond, except, unfortunately, in many cities, it's just transferring that child to another classroom or another school, and that's not the answer. I often ask children, if you were a judge and you were in a courtroom and you had somebody in front of you that had tortured an animal, what would you do? And while most people will half-jokingly say, let's execute the person or put them in jail, the serious answer is that there does need to be a certain amount of punishment, but punishment alone is not going to change behavior. I truly believe that we need a psychological protocol that counsels people on getting in touch with empathy and compassion and why they are doing this to animals. And I think it's important for the country to recognize that there is two forms of abuse. There are those people who purposely go out of their way to torture and hurt animals. That's one protocol. The other is almost this phenomenon of people who neglect animals and let these animals die a slow death. It's not the same as the person who tortures or burns an animal. And to my knowledge, there's no protocol in this country for responding to that and counseling those people. And until we come up with that, punishment alone is not going to stop animal neglect. Statistically, there's been a tremendous rise in the number of animal cruelty cases, but it very much raises the question, like with cancer, how much of it was well documented years ago and that we didn't know about. I think that there was a phenomenal amount of animal cruelty and neglect that there was just no response to. But I also think that while we are doing a much better job of prosecuting and investigating these cases, I'm disturbed and think that there is an increase in it, that I think that violence has become an option for too many people, especially in the inner city. We have children growing up, and this is a new phenomenon, young children watching animals being fought, being tortured and abused, while a black and white police car drives by without a response. There couldn't be a worse message to be sent to children and our community when we don't respond. And I see more and more inner city violence involving animals, and to this date, we're not responding enough. And what does it say about society? Well, I think Gandhi said it best. To paraphrase Gandhi, a society will be judged by the way it treats its animals. And we're not doing a very good job. I'd say right now we'd probably get a failing grade from Gandhi. I actually didn't intend to purposely get involved in animal cruelty investigations. It was really from being a rescuer in Los Angeles, and word started to get out among the rescue community that there was a lawyer doing rescuing, a prosecutor. And I started getting calls from all over the city and county of LA with people saying, I know of animal abuse and neglect, and I've called every agency in the government and nobody's responding. And this happened more and more, and I would try to use my clout as a prosecutor to get investigations going, and found that there was just no place to go. There were people calling me about dog fights that were about to happen that night, and in Los Angeles there was nobody to call. And I eventually took it upon myself to make Los Angeles a city that handles these cases aggressively, and probably the #1 city in the country right now as far as going after people that abuse and neglect animals. And it really started from being a rescuer. Yeah. My animals had such an important part of my recovery. First of all, when I got sick with the cancer, it's one of the most lonely feelings in the world. But being able to come home to animals, dogs and cats that need help, first of all, they unconditionally love you, but they taught me something else. It was impossible for me to worry about my cancer and my health and whether I'd live or die if I have a dog or a cat in front of me that needs fluids, that needs medication, that needs love. It's very hard to be into your own head when you're taking care of somebody else. So my animals really became an outlet for not worrying about my cancer, and really taught me more and more how to be compassionate and helpful to other people with cancer. I really attribute a large part of my recovery to being with my animals. And the irony of this is that when I was sick, one of the first things my family wanted me to do was get rid of my animals, because they thought, oh my God, you have stress of taking care of them, the infections, the disease, the bacteria. They never understood that this was my lifeline, was my animals, and it still is. When I found out I had cancer, I had to make a decision. Do I do a bone marrow transplant and give up my life with animals, or do I keep my animals and possibly risk dying? And there was a day when Trapper, my three-legged wonder, came on the bed and put his arm, his paw, and his stump around my shoulders, and I could hear him say to me, "You need to be with us, we need to be with you. You can't give us up, no matter what happens." And it was literally that day that I made the decision to turn down a bone marrow transplant and go with an experimental medicine that ended up being the thing that saved my life and now saves thousands of people around the world. I started talking to kids really when I was asked to speak about my cancer. And I was in a classroom once talking about cancer and what it was like to have cancer. And I had photos of my animals. And it just happened to be something I wanted to show the kids. And I saw this amazing connection where kids really could understand life through the animals. And it dawned on me that if I could bring animals to schools, the animals can teach a lesson much better than Bob can teach the lesson standing in front of kids. And as I went through my cancer experience, I realized that I had a lot in common with my animals, and that we were different, and that we were being discriminated against either because I lost my hair, or one of them was a pit bull, or lost his leg. And so it came together, this connection between my cancer and what my animals were going through, and I found out the animals were the best teachers. Put it another way, you can't take a child who stutters or has a difference and put them in front of a classroom and say, "Look, this child stutters, or this child has a different color skin, you should treat him or her fairly." It doesn't work that way. It wouldn't be fair to the child in the front of the room. But you can take a three-legged dog, or a wonderful pit bull, or a little blind dog, and make the comparison between that animal and people in the world who also have differences, and the kids get it. And that's how I started this program. There have been several times when I've gone into a classroom with children who were terrified of pit bulls, to the point where they had to stand on a table they were so afraid. One little child I'll never forget reminded me at the beginning of the class to keep my pit bull away from her because she was terrified. She had been bitten twice by a pit bull when she was a child. Within 20 minutes in the classroom, this little girl raised her hand and she said, "You know what? I just realized that Amy isn't the dog that bit me when I was a kid. I'm not afraid of Amy because I know that she's not the dog that hurt me. I'm not going to be afraid of other pit bulls anymore." That happened in 20 minutes. That's how powerful this can be. One of the neatest things about doing this program is when I go back to a school a year later, and after the children say hello again to the animals, some of them will tell me about how, because of my presentation, they've changed and they've done things for animals. They've helped horses, they've played with a neighbor's dog, they wrote a letter to a legislator to change some legislation. That really is one of the most rewarding parts of this, that it has a permanent impact on children at an age when children are still forming their beliefs and are sponges, waiting for somebody to tell them, how should I think about the world? And it's a great feeling to see that these animals are having that kind of impact on children. All too often I hear people saying, "Well, that's his dog, it's not mine, he can do what he wants," or "That's not my family." It's everybody's responsibility for cruelty against everybody. And I hope if there's any message that my program sends to children and they send to other people, to their parents and friends, is that it is our responsibility, no matter who is a victim, whether it's our own dog, our sister, a brother, a neighbor, or somebody across town. You know, while punishment and counseling are important tools to change the way people act towards animals, that's not the solution. The long-term solution has to be in our schools. Teachers not only should be able to, they must be required to include in the curriculum, not in a 10-minute segment or one visitor to a class. It needs to be throughout the curriculum, from kindergarten through high school and college and graduate school, that empathy and respect for animals is a critical part of our society. It needs to be taught as a value. We see more and more where society is going back to old values, teaching honesty, respect, compassion, but I don't see it with animals. And all too often I've had schools who say, "It's great what you do, Bob, but we don't let animals on our campus," or "We can't let dogs," or "People have this problem or that problem." I have college campuses where I can't bring my animals onto the campus to talk about animal abuse, in law schools even. Animals need to be much more part of our community, our society, and children have to be taught from the very beginning that it's okay to love animals, to help them. No, let me change that. It's not just okay. It's required of our society that you care about animals. You know, while my story with cancer is a pretty remarkable one of the things that I found out is that everybody's got a story like that. Everybody has been a victim of some sort of discrimination. We all grew up with somebody with too big ears. One of us grew up with, we had to wear clothes that somebody else made fun of in the classroom. Just the growing pains of growing up makes us all different. And we've all experienced that feeling of being alone, of being different, of wanting to be part of a group. In every community all over the country, anybody can do this presentation. You don't have to be a cancer survivor. You don't have to have a three-legged dog to be able to show children with using animals that being different, that being diverse is a good thing, and that the root of discrimination is not respecting people's differences. I'm just, I'm thinking out loud here. Whenever I do these presentations, I'll have an adult come with me, and invariably they'll be listening and they'll realize, oh my God, I remember when I was a victim of discrimination, not necessarily skin color or hair or accent, but just the way I looked as a child. In fact, when I grew up, my ears were too big for me, and kids would make fun of me. To this day, I still remember that. And when those little incidents happen, if kids could be reminded that it's okay to be that way, that be reminded that we are all different, that we will always be different, and that is a wonderful thing. It'll make it easier for everyone, and I really think it's the root of compassion. So I guess my message is that while I'm so proud of this presentation and my animals and my stories, everybody has a story of being different and feeling alone, and how their story relates to discrimination in society. So I encourage parents and teachers who've seen this video and have heard our stories, go back into your community and talk about it with your children and in your classrooms, because that's really where compassion will start, and it's the only place. I get letters all the time from children after they've heard our presentation saying about now they know that treating people with respect is okay, that a three-legged dog is a special dog, that just because an animal or a person is blind doesn't mean that there's something wrong with them. The message comes across, and the letters are heartwarming and show that children can learn from this, and it will influence them for the rest of their lives. I treasure those letters.